All right, now let's talk about three-dimensional transformations. So in the last lesson, I showed you how we can use the translate function to move this box along the horizontal or the vertical axis. But we can also move this box along the z-axis. The z-axis is essentially a line that comes from the screen towards our eyes. So we can move this box closer or farther from us. Let me show you. So here we use the transform property. Now, in the last lesson, we talked about the translate function, which is a shorthand for translate x and translate y. But we also have translate z. If we pass a positive value, this box will move closer to us. And if we use a negative value, this box will move farther away. So let's see what happens. Look, nothing happens because we haven't defined a perspective here. So before calling this function, we have to use the perspective function to define a virtual space. So here we can say 200 pixels. That means the distance between this element and us is 200 pixels. This is just an arbitrary value. It doesn't matter what we pass. So if we have 200 pixel space between this element and us, and then move it 50 pixels away, here's what we get. See? That's pretty cool. Now, what if we use a positive value? The box moves closer to us. So this is about moving in the three-dimensional space. But we can also rotate our elements in the three-dimensional space. So earlier we talked about the rotate function. Let's say rotate 45 degrees. When we call this function, we are rotating along the z-axis. But we can also rotate this along the horizontal or the vertical axis. So let's see what happens if we call rotate y. See? The box is rotating along the vertical axis. So here's the vertical axis. We're rotating this box along the vertical axis. Now I got a question for you. Can you tell me where the origin of rotation is? It's this point right here, the center. So we are rotating this element around its center. But we can easily move the origin of transformation. So we have this property, transform origin. Here we have to use two values, one for the x offset, the other for the y offset. If we use 0, 0, that means top left corner of this box. So now the rotation is a little bit different. Now, what if you want to move the origin of transformation to this point over here? Well, for the x offset, we're going to use 0. And for the y offset, we're going to use 50%. So now we get a more realistic view of rotating this element along the vertical axis. So this is all about moving and rotating elements in the three-dimensional space. Now, what if we have multiple elements here? So back to our markup, I'm going to duplicate this box. We can hover over each box and we get this effect. But what if you want to transform both these boxes as a whole? Well, we need to wrap these inside a container. So let's add a div with the class of container and move these boxes right here. Then we're going to apply this transformation to our container. So when we hover over the container, we're going to apply this transformation. So here's what we get. Now, what if you want to apply different transformations to different elements in this container? Well, then we don't want to apply this transformation on the container. We want to apply it to individual elements. For example, we say, when we hover over this container, our boxes should have this transformation. Perhaps we could have other kinds of elements like circles or whatever, and those elements will have different transformations. So now let's see what happens when we save the changes. See, we have a weird perspective here because with this new implementation, each box is getting its own perspective. To make this more real, we want to make sure that all these elements share the same perspective. So we need to define a rule for our container. And here we use the perspective property to define a perspective for all children of this container. This is where we use 200 pixels. And now we can get rid of this perspective function. So in CSS, we have a perspective function, which we apply as part of a transformation. But we also have a perspective property, which we apply to a parent or a container element. When we use the perspective property, we don't want to use the perspective function because we want to make sure that all these children share the same perspective that we have defined over here. So let's delete this. Now, everything looks good. So we have two boxes and they're sharing the same perspective. With this new implementation, now we can apply a different transformation to the second box. So back to our markup, we can give the second box an extra class like box special. And then over here, we can say, when we hover over our container, this special box should have a different transformation. So here we can say transform rotate x 45 degrees. Here's what we get. So the possibilities are endless. You can get pretty creative with these transformations. So I'm not going to spend more time on this. Next, we're going to talk about transitions.